The Edmonton Oilers look to be set for success this upcoming NHL season. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So today's episode is very straightforward. We're going to talk about the roster right now as we sit a week into free agents, 4 weekdays into free agency, in comparison to where it was at the start of last season, to just kind of get a lay of the land. The idea for today's episode is very straightforward. We're going to lay it all out about the team, what it looks like right now. We're going to talk about that in relation to the team that went to the Cup final last season. Expectations, the conference at large, the league at large. So let's get on into it. Last year, it's a reasonable assessment to say the Oilers caught lightning in a bottle. And that's not meant in a derisive way. That's not meant in a way to minimize how they got to the Stanley Cup final or how they played in the regular season. Very clearly, the Oilers were a very talented team. And then they got things to break their way. They got Stuart Skinner to bounce back after a rough first month. After they tried to give Jack Campbell one last crack at it. You got to remember, Jack Campbell did not play well out of the gate. Part of the reason the Oilers got off to that terrible start they were sitting at on November 12th or 13th when they did ultimately move on from Jay Woodcroft, they couldn't buy a save. And you got to remember, very weird schedule. They'd played the Canucks like 3 times in that first few weeks. They'd really couldn't get any goaltending. Connor McDavid was dealing with an injury. You got to remember he missed a week or 2 in there. And then when he came back, he was not his usual dynamic self. So there was some adjustment period in there. And that took a little while to get going. Yes, they did rattle off a 16-game and an 8-game winning streak at various points of the regular season last year. The Oilers did not reach their peak form until the conference final against the Stars. The Kings, they very easily took care of the Kings. The Canucks, it definitely got hairy there. You know, anytime you're starting Calvin Pickard in games 4 and 5 of a second round of a playoff series, somebody who had never started an NHL playoff game before this year, and I believe Pickard's 30 years old now, so we're not exactly talking about a spring chicken. And then going back to Skinner, eking it out against Vancouver, then against the Dallas team, which was deeper than the Oilers forward group, to outstar power them, for Connor and Leon to play the way they did, for Bouchard to play the way he did, for Skinner to outbattle Jake Ottinger. All of that out simultaneously. That's a feeling, knowing we can hang with pretty much anybody. And then in the Cup final, they proved it. I don't think there's really an argument that Florida was not a deeper team. You know, you put the Oilers' first 5 guys against the Florida first 5 guys, it's pretty even. You know, you do McDavid, Draisaitl, Hyman, Nugent-Hopkins, and Bouchard against Bouchard, Barkov, Verhaeghe, Montour, etc. It's pretty close. And then you could throw Bob in there as well. Bob did end up having a pretty good final in the context of the entire series, even though he did let up 2 absolute stinker games in there. But the thing that's difficult for people to get a grasp on, and something I try and reiterate, just because you get there, just because you're good, does not mean you will be back. You look at some of the teams in recent Stanley Cup final history, recent just NHL history in general, that get to a second round or a conference final, doesn't necessarily mean they'll be back. You know, the ones that come to mind, the Nashville team that made the Cup final against Pittsburgh, they never made it that far again. That Sharks team, they made 1 Stanley Cup final last decade. The Jets, they made that 1 second round they made that 1 conference final against Vegas. Vegas' first year in the league, they did not make it back to a conference final. The Oilers' goal is to find a way to replicate the success of the Florida Panthers. going to the Stanley Cup final one year, losing, and then getting back there and winning the next year. That type of thing is really difficult to do. That doesn't happen all that often, just because the amount of variance it takes to win 3 playoff series, to get back, then win a 4th one. That's a lot of variables in a small period of time. And I'm not going to come out this early. It's July 4th. It's July 4th when I'm recording this. You'll be watching or listening on July 5th. The Oilers are going to be talented enough to get there. But the most talented team does not always win. Things break weird. Things break right. Things break wrong. With that in mind, you want to set yourself up to not get killed next year. And I'm talking about from a fan perspective, not from a team. The Oilers think they're going to be good. The Oilers think they're going to go back to the Stanley Cup final and win the thing, as they should. They are going to have easily a more talented version of the team than last year, which was already the most talented team that Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl had ever played on. They do have some stuff to address. We talked about it on yesterday's show. They need to figure out a Draisaitl extension. They need to figure out a Bouchard extension. They need to take care of Broberg and Holloway as restricted free agents. There are a lot of moving parts right now. But obviously, based on the way the contracts are structured, the ones the Oilers gave out on Monday of free agency, they know this is the year. This is going to be the last best crack at it with a deep and talented team, because Draisaitl going from $8 million a year to $13 or $14 million a year, and Evan Bouchard going up to $8 or $9 million per year, that's where you lose your depth. That is the point of the salary cap. It is to cripple good teams and mitigate their ability to maintain strong rosters. They want to bleed their depth and say, okay, you have stars. That's great. Look at the situation Colorado's in right now. And Colorado has some unforced errors in there, giving Ross Colton that long-term contract, giving Miles Wood that long-term contract, betting on Valerie Nichushkin to get his act together, giving Gabriel Landeskog an extension right before he suffered a major knee injury. So it's a cautionary tale. It's important to have stars. You can't win the Stanley Cup without stars. You look at the recent history of the league. Real quick, we'll run this down. Barkov, Eichel, McKinnon, Stamkos, Point, Ryan O'Reilly, outlier, kind of weak. Backstrom, Crosby, Taves, Kopitar, Kopitar, and then Patrice Bergeron, and then Taves again, and then Sidney Crosby, and then Pavel Datsyuk. That is a lot of talent. Of those guys I just named, the only one that are not guaranteed Hall of Famers are Nick Backstrom and Ryan O'Reilly. And Nick Backstrom might get in because of the European factor and being Swedish, winning that gold medal in the Olympics, winning a Stanley Cup. He might get the Ovechkin bump, which might help him as well. So for the most part, you need to have a Hall of Fame first line center if you want to win the Stanley Cup. The Oilers very much have that in Connor McDavid. But where Stanley Cups ultimately get determined for the most part, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the next segment, is on the margins. Because when you get to a Stanley Cup final, most of the time the team you're playing when you get there, that team also has a really good first 3 or 4 forwards. And you need you need your stars to outplay their stars. And then you need your depth to be better than their depth. That's why it takes so much to get right, because you are talking about needing 9 or 10. You need to win at least 8 or 9 individual matchups of our 6th forward is better than their 6th forward. Our 3rd defenseman is better than their 3rd defenseman. And forwards wise, the Oilers were pretty close to Florida. But the defense, Nurse, CC, that was the difference in the Cup final. And there's a whole lot more to talk about on this episode of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. So be sure to stick around. Passion, drive, and patience. Formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available for U.S. customers. I want to thank everybody listening to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. Whether it is first thing in the morning, on the way to work, on the way to school, if there is school in the summer, I don't know. Maybe you're in college. Maybe you didn't do anything in high school and you're in summer school. But if you're listening to Locked On Oilers first thing in the morning to kind of set the tone for your day, I'm very appreciative. If you're a person who listens to stuff at the end of the day, you're winding down, you want to decompress, thank you for putting it in the rotation. This is kind of a philosophical episode because we are very far away from hockey actually being played. We got the entire month of July, the entire month of August. Yes, there are preseason games at the end of September, but no one really cares. No one really cares. Those are for the last 3 roster spots to get finalized, to get both your goalies some repetitions, to get them in game action. And that's really it. When you're a team like the Oilers that doesn't really forecast having open competition for roster spots, preseason is just about getting guys in shape. It's just about getting guys some repetitions and no one getting hurt. That's really the only goal of preseason hockey. But we're a long ways away from that. So I think it's constructive to think about these big picture ideas, to talk theoretically, because we don't treat hockey or sports in general as an idea. Too often we are caught up in analyzing what's already happened and trying to use that to forecast as to what's going to happen. And that can be helpful. But generally speaking, statistics are descriptive, not predictive. Certain things are cyclical, certain traits, certain statistics where if you perform in a certain range, you can safely be assumed to produce at that level over and over again. But for the most part, you're not going to have a good read on the Oilers of next year until probably the end of December, early January, where you'll get a read on if they're in the Stanley Cup contender tier, if they're middle of the conference tier, or if they're bubble. If the Oilers are a bubble team, something went very wrong. There is a world where, the Canucks are better than them in the regular season. Maybe the Stars are better than them in the regular season. And, they're second or third in the West and they're second in their division. And that's not the end of the world because as last regular season showed you, they don't need to be the first place team in the conference or have home ice advantage to go on and win. They didn't have that against Vancouver. They didn't have that against Dallas. And that does matter. Being able to win games on the road, that is important. So the next thing I wanted to touch on in this abstract of talking about the Oilers check-in, we know their undoing was ultimately their defense. Whether you want to talk about CC or Darnell Nurse, if you want to talk about Vinny Desharnais, if you want to talk about the rough game Evan Bouchard had in the Cup final, the Oilers need their defense to be better, and that is part of a philosophical idea. You want your defense to be a team effort. You heard me talk about this a lot in the Cup final in regards to Florida, that part of the reason Florida plays such good defense is that their forwards are wholly invested in it, that their forwards play defense almost as well as their defensemen because it's a group effort. They constantly have 4 or 5 skaters in the frame. They're pressuring puck carriers. They're forcing puck carriers to make decisions before they want to. If the Oilers are going to mitigate what didn't work for them last year, they're going to need shorter breakouts. They are going to need their forwards to come back. And the Oilers, by design, they do that. The Oilers like an organized regroup where a forward will come back, they will get the puck on a regroup, and then build up speed to try and put pressure on the other team in the neutral zone. The counterpoint and the struggle with that is if the other team lines up a 1-4 or a 1-3-1, trying to bob and weave through all that traffic for anybody other than McDavid, that's not really that doable. That's why I like the Jeff Skinner edition, because he's another guy who's very strong at skating the puck through traffic and carrying the puck into the offensive zone. That's what I'm encouraged about. When you look at a hypothetical Oilers top 9, it might be the best top 9 in the entire NHL. Now, I have to go and do some research. I got to piece together what teams look like after the transactions of free agency, but you think about it. I said this the other day, and I still got to do some more research, but Skinner and Arvidsson might be the best 2 non-McDavid, Draisaitl, and Hyman, not Draisaitl, excuse me, the best 2 McDavid, non-McDavid, Hyman, or Nugent-Hopkins forwards that Leon Draisaitl's ever played with. Yes, Evander Kane scored a lot of goals over the years in his 13-year NHL career. Jeff Skinner's had 30 goals 6 times. Jeff Skinner won a Calder. And Victor Arvidsson is a really consistent play driver, somebody who's created offense at a reasonably high level a lot. And when I say create offense, I'm not talking about just goals and assists. I am saying his style, being able to carry the puck into the zone, being able to forecheck well, those traits correlate to creating offense. And it gives the Oilers more versatility. Because Arvidsson is somebody that no matter who you play him with, if you play him with Draisaitl, or if you play him on the third line with like Ryan McLeod and Adam Henrique, that also could work because those are strong skaters. Those are guys who are comfortable playing the boards, winning puck battles. And then when you have versatility, you have more options. For so long, the Oilers' big issue was a lack of depth. And that's why they've had to make decisions like bringing in guys like Evander Kane on cheap contracts, because they didn't have the talent. You know, we're not that far removed from Zach Kassian playing with Connor McDavid. And that wasn't good for anybody. That was such a clearly faulty decision that I don't understand what the vision was. And then ditto on the back end. You know, we're not that far removed from Darnell Nurse being the number one defenseman on this team. We're like 3 years removed from this team's big plan being Duncan Keith. The Oilers have almost improbably navigated a lot of bad roster decisions. And yeah, they're still dealing with the repercussions of some of those, you know, having Kane on the books, and it's going to be difficult to move him. We talked about that on yesterday's show. Having Nurse at the contract number he's at of $9.125 million, that's a difficult contract that you're not going to be able to move. Having to buy out Jack Campbell, having to trade Milan Lucic for James Neal, and then buying out James Neal. The Oilers have improbably kind of struck oil here, for the lack of a better word, and not to make a pun, but they've kind of hit that sweet spot of we've gotten through our mistakes, and they haven't totally prevented us from improving the team. But we've got one more crack at this. And that's really what makes this upcoming season so tantalizing, but also so stressful. The minute Bouchard goes from being on a restricted free agent deal to a long-term contract, yes, some of those years will be restricted free agent, but the second Bouchard goes from being a young guy on a reasonable contract to one of the best defensemen in the world on an expensive contract, and the second Leon Draisaitl goes from one of the better value contracts in the league to one of the 5 highest paid players in the league, that's it. That's all your flexibility. You're done. After those 2 contract extensions, you are not going to be able to afford to really tinker without subtracting good players. And that's really the conundrum good teams get into. How can we create more cap space? How can we improve our roster? And yes, the Oilers are afforded the luxury that the salary cap is actually supposed to start increasing year over year, as opposed to Gary and the boys saying, we can do $1 million more every year for 4 years. You know, we're not that far removed from where the salary cap was 4 or 5 years ago. Yes, that was the pandemic's fault, but at the same time, the NHL owners wanted their money back, as opposed to maybe looking at the bigger picture and saying, if we pay the guys a little bit more, we might be able to get better teams. We might be able to go further. We might be able to make more money overall. The owners irk me. I don't want to turn this into me on my soapbox about the owners. There's plenty of time for that this summer. We're going to take one more quick break here on Locked On Oilers. Then we're going to come back. We're going to tackle one last big idea, so be sure to stick around. Thank you to everybody listening to this Friday episode of Locked On Oilers. Down here in the States, most people have parlayed this into a 4-day weekend where 4th of July was Thursday. They've taken off or have off on Friday and turned this into 4 straight days. Very much looking forward to watching Euros. I'm going to Yankees Red Sox tonight at Yankee Stadium. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in the sports world this time of year. And yes, I do mean that, because regular season baseball is not for the faint of heart. And the WNBA is very fun. As much as people may or may not like to dump on it or turn it into something it's not, WNBA is a lot of fun. So the last big picture idea I wanted to tackle as far as the Oilers, they are reaching probably close to what they can max out their roster at. Like we just talked about, as soon as you pay Bouchard, as soon as you pay Draisaitl, you are not going to be able to improve the roster more, because that's going to be all your flexibility. We're talking about probably doubling Bouchard's money and coming close to doubling Draisaitl's money. Draisaitl's not going to get $16-17 million a year. He very well could get 14. He could get 14 and a half if the salary cap takes a bigger jump than expected. And the problem for the Oilers is they're not going to wait on that. They are going to get that taken care of this summer, so that's not looming over the team next year. You hate seeing that situation where it lingers over the team and it becomes a distraction, because as much as the guy is going to want to say, I'm not thinking about it, I'm not worried about it, they're people. They can try their best to block something out, but eventually their emotions do take over, their feelings do take over, and it's really difficult to kind of mitigate that, handle that, block that noise out, and it does begin to weigh on you. You know, you look at that Mitch Marner situation in Toronto, where there is real hunger for change over there in Toronto, that people are ready to throw Marner overboard. And I don't think there's a world where trading one of the 10, 15 best players in the world is going to make your team better. But I do think it might lead you to striking a better combination of players. And that's what I wanted to get in, the last point I wanted to get in on. For so long, the Oilers kind of felt like a kid playing the EA Sports NHL video game where it's, oh, that guy's good, let's put him here. That guy's good, let's put him here. Without a conscious effort of how the pieces are going to really fit together. And that's really that's the final stage of roster construction. It is one thing to have a talented roster. Hell, the Buffalo Sabres have had some pretty talented rosters. The Ottawa Senators have had some pretty talent-laden rosters over the last handful of seasons. Those teams' problems, aside from coaching, they have not struck the right combination of skill sets. And that's really the trickiest part of putting pieces together is, does this guy fit with this guy? And in a vacuum, it's taken the Oilers a while to find these complementary pieces. Zach Hyman is great playing with Connor McDavid because he doesn't mind going to the net front, eating a beating, and he's still got enough puck skills to not just be a plug. You know, they've tried the plug thing. They tried doing the Zach Kassian stands in front of the net and shoots pucks, but it's not the same thing as Zach Hyman doing it, because Zach Hyman is a quality hockey player. And nobody forecasted him being a 50-goal guy in Edmonton, but it wasn't a crazy imagination. It didn't take a crazy leap of imagination to envision him going from 25 to 30, maybe 35, playing on the best power play in the league and playing most of his 5-on-5 minutes with Connor McDavid. Now you have real flexibility. You have brought in a lot of different players with different skill sets. You know, you bring in Connor Brown, you bring back Connor Brown, you bring back Adam Henry. You've still got McLeod. You've got Dylan Holloway lingering over this. You've still got Nuge. You've obviously got McDavid and Draisaitl. And then you bring in Skinner. You bring in Arvidsson. You bring back Janmark. And like, there's a world where the Oilers are playing Ryan McLeod on their fourth line next year, or playing Evander Kane on their fourth line next year. And the Oilers do need to create some cap space. They're over the cap ceiling right now. You're allowed to be 10% over in the offseason. They still have to figure out what they're going to do with Holloway and Broberg. Those guys are probably going to get the short end of the stick because neither of them have arbitration rights. So they basically don't have a choice. They either sit out next season or they take what the Oilers offer them. So that's something to keep in mind. So that means they're going to have to subtract from this team. Now, whether that's Cody Ceci, whether that's Brett Kulak, whether that's Evander Kane, they're going to have to take something out of this group. And the way the Oilers are set up, they are going to be dependent on their forwards to do a lot of the heavy. They have one elite defensive pair. I think there's a real argument Ekholm and Bouchard might be the best defensive pair in the entire NHL, based on the way their skill sets complement each other, based on the way they're used, the way they impact the game. And that's great. When you have a best first pair in the NHL, you've got 25 minutes of the game pretty much under control. And yeah, there are going to be mistakes. They will be on the ice for goals against. But when you've got the game under control, that's where you can let your stars go to work and impose their will on the game. The Oilers' issue is that once you get past that first pair, it gets dicey. Whether it's Kulak, whether it's Troy Stetcher, whether it's Nurse, whether it's Ceci, whether it's Broberg, the Oilers are going to spend a lot of next season trying to figure out that bottom four defenseman. What's the right combination of who plays with who? what's the right usage and what's the right assignment. I really don't want to see Joshua Brown. The more I read about Joshua Brown's underlying numbers, it genuinely feels like people weren't exaggerating when they said he was the worst player in the entire NHL. So that's something to keep in mind as you think about what the final stage of the Oilers looks like, because this is it. As soon as they pay Draisaitl, as soon as they pay Bouchard, they are into the capped out territory. They will be where the Avalanche are. They will be close to where the Rangers are once the Rangers figure out their restricted free agents, because the Rangers are in a very similar boat where Andre Miller and Alexis Lafreniere are on restricted free agent contracts that go into restricted free agency next year, but they both have arbitration rights. And then Igor Shesterkin's only getting $5.5 million a year. It's not a big leap to go, oh yeah, Shesterkin going from 5.5 to 11.5. It's pretty similar to Draisaitl going from 8 to 14. Lafreniere going from 2.7 something, I think is what he's on right now, up to 7 or 8. That's pretty similar to what Bouchard is. And then Andre Miller's another guy who's going to probably double his average salary if the Rangers go term on him. So the Oilers are not the only team in this boat. It is very important that the Oilers find the right general manager to execute this vision, because this is arguably the closest you're going to get to really earning your money as a general manager. General managers can do a lot. They can trade, they can draft, they can waive guys, they can sign guys in free agency, they can make calls. There are a lot of things general managers can do. The most important thing a general manager does in hockey when they're assembling the roster is keeping the money in mind, because you have to balance the short term with the long term. And because of that, a lot of general managers get caught up in the, okay, well, we have a good team right now, so we need to maintain what we are right now, but I also need to worry about the future. So I need to lock this guy up long term because he's good right now. And if he turns out to be bad 3 or 4 years from now, we'll figure it out when we get there. A lot of GMs don't have to worry about that second part of that contract. A lot of GMs, they last 4.5, 5 seasons. So you sign a guy to a 7-year contract. Most GMs do not live their job out to see the end of that tenure. That's why free agency is always so funny, because it's GMs trying to save their own jobs, making problems for the guy who replaces them for doing a bad job. That's the ironic part of free agency. Teams trying to fill holes way too aggressively and ending up with things like a James Neal contract, a Milan Lucic contract. You look at some of the ones that went out on Monday, end up with a Chandler Stevenson contract or a Nikita Zadorov contract. You don't want to be one of those teams. You want to be closer to where the Stars are at, where, yeah, Sagan and Ben are making a ton of money, but they were able to build out a roster around those guys. And that will be the look for the Oilers. How can we continue to model our team around Draisaitl and McDavid the way the Stars did around Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin? And I don't imagine McDavid and Draisaitl having as much of a fall off as Ben and Seguin, who are now, middle six guys as opposed to superstars. But there will come a time where the Oilers can't just bank on McDavid and Draisaitl going crazy being the difference most nights. But that will just about do it for this edition of Locked On Oilers. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, take an extra second. Please leave the show a 5-star review. It helps other people find the show, join the conversation. If you are watching over on YouTube, hi, hello. You see the sweat building on my forehead. You know I'm eager to turn my ring light off. Hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. Leave me a comment. What is your big picture question about the Oilers? And I'll answer some of them sometime next week. Hope everybody has a safe, enjoyable weekend. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Until then, let's go Oilers.